Welcome to Open Minds. I'm your host, Christopher Balkrin, and Jordan Peterson recently had Bruce Pardy, professor of Queen's University, on, as well as Konstantin Kisin from Trigonometry, love that name, by the way, to discuss Bill C-63, the Online Harm Reductions Act here in Canada. And the angle that Peterson took on that discussion, which I'll leave a link below, was specifically about how the bill seeks to reduce or attack freedom of speech and expression on Canadians. In fact, I think one of the headlines for that conversation was like, watch out, Canada, or be aware, Canadians, of what this bill means. And definitely there are elements of the bill which bring into question our ability to be truly free in our speech and our expression online. But there's another part to the bill that I wish Peterson would have talked about and spent more time at discussing as his role as a clinical psychologist. And that's the real content that youth in particular are being exposed to at a younger and younger age group. And so the impetus of the bill, of Bill C-63 here in Canada, was because youth are online more than ever before, and their exposure to the types of content that we see, whether they're violent images and videos, hypersexualized images and videos, robberies, thieving, all types of things that are happening in real time, that's appearing on our feeds. And parent groups and others are just generally concerned about that, the impact that has on youth. Particularly because when you think about it, this is kind of like a social experiment on the population. I mean, never in human history, to my knowledge, have youth been this exposed to such extreme actions in our society at such a young age. And we really don't know the impact this will have on a youth's mental health into their adolescence and then into their adulthood. And that's the conversation I think we need to be having, as potentially unsexy as it might be, because I'd love to know the answer to the question, if a youth is exposed, let's say, to a lot of violence, violent videos, violent pictures, etc., at a young age, and that's consistent over days, weeks, months, years, does that I'm assuming that child gets eventually desensitized to it, but is that person into adulthood more or less likely to either engage in violent acts or have some other mental health issue that could be linked to that exposure at a young age? And I'm sure there's a lot of research about, children from violent homes, where parents are fighting, siblings are physically fighting, etc., and how that impacts them later on in life. I'm certain there's a ton of research there. But when it comes to video and that medium, I wonder if there's a different impact as a result. The video you just swipe through, oh, I don't like that, turn off your phone, whatever, and it's done. Whereas if you enter a house and there's people, at each other's throats every night, it's like that will really impact a youth, perhaps indelibly. So I wish the conversation was about that, because again, as a clinical psychologist, I'd love to hear Peterson's insights on that. And maybe he has shared that in other podcasts, which I haven't listened to, so that could be my error. But the fact that Peterson focused on the freedom of speech and freedom of expression piece, sadly to me, is like kind of a bit on brand for Peterson, because there are real concerns with Bill C-63 when it comes to freedom of speech and expression. But Peterson has, over the years, really hammered home that, the government of Canada is reducing our freedom of speech and expression through bills like Bill C-63 and others. And I think that's a very important conversation to have. But again, I think there's also there's a missing link here. A government wouldn't put forward a bill if they weren't like either under pressure by civil societies or there was real issues that a bill needed to address. The other piece to this is I wish Peterson's conversation would have also focused on the regulatory body that the government is now creating more government into our lives as a result of Bill C-63. And so as a result of Bill C-63, governments are pressuring big tech to, update or make sure their algorithms are not pushing harmful content, having a robust way of notifying big tech when there is harmful content, other methods to basically prevent certain content from showing up in the feeds of youth in particular. And I think that's also a very worthwhile conversation to have, because it wasn't that long ago, before the advent of the internet, you'd go to a video store and there would be a curtain and it would have the extreme violence as well as the porno and kids weren't allowed in there. And so that was like the common kind of like low-hanging fruit, easy way of regulating the content that youth could not be exposed to. But today, in this digital age, it's almost demanding government to increase its regulatory apparatus. In some ways, you could actually make the argument that with the advent of the internet and social media and all this new tech, it requires bigger government, because government just it's too slow and cumbersome. And so it requires government to engage in a regulatory body, because a regulatory atmosphere, because there is no physical curtain that you could place on your phone if you're accessing sexually explicit or extremely violent content. And so pressuring big tech through regulatory policy is that actual curtain where porno and everything else remains. So it's interesting that Peterson didn't talk about that. And I think one thing I want to just emphasize here is there's something to be said about the power of Jordan Peterson's voice and his ability to shape a narrative. Jordan Peterson, over the past almost 10 years now, has not only risen in prominence, but he's actually an influencer in terms of how many Canadians and people writ large are looking at government policies, how they're framing government policies. I mean, it's a really powerful position to be in for any one individual. But with that power, I hate to say some Marvel superheroes thing, but with great power comes great responsibility. It's almost incumbent on Peterson to be more judicious in his framing of how one is to look at a bill, and leaving out the impetus for the bill and why it was created, again, is on brand for Peterson, but also has the ability to shape how we view the bill itself. For example, I may go to a debate with the prime minister, etc., and I might ask, Mr. Prime Minister, Bill C-63 limits my freedom of speech and expression. And I only think about that conversation that Peterson had on his podcast, and the Prime Minister could very well say, well, Christopher, did you know that, youth are being exposed to violence, hypersexualized images, etc., and video at a really high rate, and we don't know the impact this is having on youth, which is why we're increasing our regulatory bodies to put pressure on these big tech companies to engage in better controls on their platforms. It's like, I would be dumbfounded. How do I respond to that? Because that seems like a pretty legitimate line to follow as to why the bill was created. So again, because Peterson has such a powerful role in the framing of our discourse today, there's an even greater responsibility that Peterson does a better he undertakes more responsibility in framing those conversations appropriately. But I don't know, am I expecting a lot or too much? I'm not sure, but I know a lot of Canadians are watching Peterson and his content and formulating their opinions with that in mind. So love to know what you think. Let me know in the comment section below if you also experience this. I think this is a conversation we need to keep having because there's a real crossroads freedom of speech and expression has with recognizing the online harms that youth may be very well exposed to. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comment section below.